Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So I'm on Eccleston Square in London, one of the houses where Churchill lived. He lived at several different London addresses. So Churchill's obviously most renowned for having been Prime Minister of the United Kingdom twice, and the first time was during the Second World War. But he was really a Renaissance man. He was the public school fencing champion. He won some national prize for declamation. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was a historian. He was a journalist. He was really accomplished all round. He'd been an army officer, though he didn't rise to particularly high rank. So he really was distinguished in several disparate fields. So Churchill was born at the end of November 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxford, Oxfordshire. It's about 10 miles north of Oxford. And he was born a bit premature, which might explain where he was a bit undersized. He's about 5'5", and he had a shoulder that was quite often easily dislocated. So his mother was Jenny Jerome, born to a very wealthy New York family. Churchill claimed to have been a quarter Iroquois, Native American, but apparently that's not true. So his mother's family was, I think, entirely English in their ancestry, but had been in America for a few generations. And his father was Lord Randolph Churchill. So his father was the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough. The Duke of Marlborough being one of the United Kingdom's leading noblemen. There are about 30 non-royal dukes in the United Kingdom. So Duke is a very high noble title, a hereditary title, goes from father to eldest son. So Randolph Churchill didn't inherit it. That's Churchill's father, and obviously then Winston Churchill wasn't going to inherit it. So the Churchills, well, they've been prominent in that part of England for centuries. There's a village in Oxfordshire named Churchill. The family's named after the village, not the village after the family. But anyway, I think it was in Wiltshire, which is just one to the west of Oxfordshire, where they were gentlemen in the 17th century. Now, very few people get to be called gentlemen. You had to be a landowner, even not on a huge scale, but a few hundred acres to count as a gentleman. And the English Civil War broke out, and they're on the royalist side in that war. So Churchill was someone who was very passionate, but always really liked to take sides. But the trouble is, he could see right and wrong on both sides, so often couldn't figure out which side he should be on. Should it be on that of authority, or should it be that of the rebels? But anyway, so they suffered a bit under Cromwell, the Churchill family, but then there was the Restoration, Charles II and James II, and the Churchill family rose to prominence under Sir John Churchill. He was then made a baronet to pass down from father to son, and John Churchill's sister became the mistress of King James II. Now, committing adultery is obviously a venial sin, but if you're doing it with the king, well, then that's not quite so bad. And having some children by James II. But John Churchill, he actually turned against James II. In 1681, he helped him crush the Duke of Monmouth, that rebellion. But in 1685, he helped crush the Duke of Monmouth. And in 1688, John Churchill, along with almost every other general, changed sides. He turned his coat and he joined William of Orange in his attempt to usurp the crown, and James II was sent packing. But anyway, so treason was very handsomely rewarded. John Churchill became one of the most senior generals in the British Army, fighting a lot of these wars in the continent under Queen Anne as well. The Battle of Oudenarde. He won the Battle of Blenheim in what's now Bavaria, well, Germany, against the Bavarians and the French. And so he was made the Duke of Marlborough because they owned estates near Marlborough. And Blenheim Palace was the family seat, as named after Blindheim, the German village, but in English we call it Blenheim. And it really is magnificent, granted a huge sum of money by Parliament, and that's that. So it was designed by Vanbrugh, that celebrated architect of the era. And there's a huge tapestry of the Battle of Blenheim, and some of the trees which are planted on the estate are laid out to represent troop positions at the Battle of Blenheim and so forth. So that was that. So the title Duke of Marlborough is going to this day, and the current holder of the title is a collateral descendant of Winston Churchill. Anyway, so Churchill, his parents had a rather fractious marriage. A few years younger than was his brother Jack, and then his parents were largely living separate lives. Of course, the media would never dare report that in those days. His father was a bit of a philanderer. His father had been to Eton and Merton College, Oxford. His parents had met at Cowes Week. Cows, not bovines, as in C-O-W-E-S, on the Isle of Wight. Every August there was a yachting regatta and that was the place to be seen in those days, not just for British high society, but people from France and Germany and so forth. And the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, was very keen on it. Now, in the 20th century, we had long-distance travel, and very few of the British upper class would spend August in this country. They would be going to the French Riviera, to Liguria, to the Caribbean, elsewhere. But anyway, so his parents had met there. Lord Randolph Churchill pressed his suit. They got married very quickly, a whirlwind romance. And some people say, was she even pregnant before she got married? She was quite young. She was only about 19 when she got married, said to have a pantherine sexuality. His father, Randolph Churchill, he later contracted syphilis. But anyway, so Churchill went to St George's School, Ascot, then a boys' prep school, and now it's a girls' secondary school, where the discipline was severe. Now, this is an era where corporal punishment was used all too frequently, but the headmaster appears to have been a flagellomaniac, and he couldn't master mensah and all this Latin grammar. Trying to memorize those tables bored him rigid, so he was regularly caned for just not remembering things, and his mother was horrified by the brutality of it. Anyway, later he went to Harrow School, but his parents were quite cold and distant towards him. So, you know, materially he lacked for nothing. He was very upper class, very well off, and a lot of people lived in grinding poverty at the time. He went to Harrow School because he was no use at classics. People thought he was a dimwit. You could read his part of his autobiography, My Early Life, and he claims when he was sitting common entrance exam to get into Harrow, he wrote number 1, as in question 1. After much reflection, he put brackets around it. He couldn't think of anything relevant or true to say about the question, and he did not write anything else. And he said, it was on this slender evidence of scholarship that I was allowed to pass into Harrow School. But apparently that's a lie, that he did try decently. And he didn't care for games like cricket. At one time he had to write a report on a cricket match, and so he just drew some puddles and ducks and said, rained off. History doesn't record what he got for that piece of work. Anyway, so then he was at Harrow School, and the brightest boys would concentrate heavily on Latin, Greek, and Churchill later wrote, I would let them learn Latin if they were good, and I'd let them learn Greek for a treat. But if they couldn't write English properly, I'd whip them, and I'd whip them hard for that, saying that the dullest boy must get into his bones a British sentence. Curious he didn't say English sentence, actually. But anyway, so the dimmer boys were meant to go to the army. There was an army class specifically to prepare them for that. And you might want to go to the artillery. Probably not. Artillery and engineers, if you're a bit geeky, very good at your sums. If you're not so smart, the infantry. And really the dimmest of the dim would join the cavalry. And so because he was seen to be a nincompoop, he was fit for the cavalry. Anyway, so he got into Sandhurst, which had been found not long before, the Royal Military Academy, and he was duly commissioned. And I can't remember which it was in the Oxfordshire Hussars or whatever. Hussars, I don't know if they were actually going around with swords in those days, only for ceremonial purposes, like Hungarian cavalry troops or something. And he was posted to India for a while. Before he even arrived, he decided he would be bored silly with India, and there was really nothing worthwhile learning about India. So I'm afraid he was very close-minded on that one. But he had a lot of free time in his hands, and he read voraciously. Read on Gibbon, his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in particular. And so he vouchsafed in a letter that he was trying to figure out his political position. Was he a liberal? Was he conservative? He decided he was a liberal, really. But his family connections were all conservative. So we'll see he was very much an arriviste. It would be more expedient to call himself a Tory. His father invented the term Tory democracy. Well, when Churchill was 20, both his father died and Mrs. Everest, his nanny. Churchill had been brought up to call her Womany, this woman from Kent. So, and Churchill was really distraught about that. I should have mentioned that she was an ardent Protestant and disliked even the High Church movement within the Church of England, thought was deeply suspicious, something to do with the Fenians in Ireland. And when Churchill was a toddler, he'd lived, well actually he wasn't that, yeah, when he was a toddler he'd lived in Dublin, in Phoenix Park, in the Under-Secretary's Lodge, because his grandfather was briefly the Viceroy of Ireland, and his father was the Under-Secretary for Ireland in the government. And Churchill got to know T.H. Burke, a high-ranking civil servant. And then they left Ireland, and a couple of years later, Churchill found that lovely Mr. Burke, who was so nice to him, had been murdered by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which left Churchill with a lifelong antipathy to Irish republicanism. Anyway, so he was out in India, and he was in the Malakand Field Force, fighting in what we'd now call Pakistan. He was a very gallant, and he often exposed himself to fire when there was no military rationale for doing so, saying he wanted to command other men and he believed it would give him credibility if he showed his valor. Anyway, so that was enough. He stayed in touch with the Indian servant for life and was forever sending him money. He never returned to India again in his life. So there were other places he went to. He went to Sudan. He pulled a few strings because he knew all the right people and got assigned to Lord Kitchener's staff. Well, he wasn't Lord Kitchener till afterwards, who was a very forbidding figure. So he was there at the Battle of Omdurman, took part in a cavalry charge, and his shoulder became dislocated at exactly the wrong moment, just as they charged into a gully, which to their surprise was filled with dervishes, as in the followers of the Mahdi. Anyway, so he drew his revolver and was able to shoot some of them, and as he said, how easy it is to kill a man. Anyway, he was very even-handed, and he was absolutely frank in telling the truth, even when it reflected discredit on his own nation. And so that after the Battle of the Omdurman, some of these Sudanese soldiers were killed whilst wounded. Now, was this an act of mercy? If you know someone is fatally wounded and you're just finishing them off because otherwise they're going to die in agony over several hours, even the rats and vultures would come down and pick them off, or was this just wanton killing, men who could have been saved but were killed anyway? So he wrote an account of it entitled The River War. He also wrote a book called The Malakand Field Force. He tried to get into journalism. He once had to give a report in person to Kitchener, which he found petrifying. He never seems to have been so scared of anything in all his life. But I can imagine, because how old was he then? If you're 23 and this is perhaps the most senior officer in the British Army and you're a nothing, you don't want to mess it up. Anyway, so he also went to Cuba to see the Cuban rebellion, to report on that, and he couldn't figure out what his sympathies with the insurgents or with the Spanish government. So there was a very much romantic side to him, where he sometimes identified with rebels against governments, and sometimes there was the more small c authoritarian side to him, which said no, governments must be able to quell risings. So he went to South Africa. The South African conflict broke out in October 1899, the Second South African War, the Boer War, as we largely called it. Again, he's supposed to be a war correspondent, but he got involved in combat. He was trying to have the best of both worlds when his train was ambushed, and eventually was taken prisoner. Now, no discredit is reflected on him for having been taken prisoner. Now, the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, they were trying to figure out what to do with him. You know, if you're a journalist, you must stay as a journalist and not carry a firearm, and certainly not engage in a battle. And if you do, you're pretending to be a civilian, but you're actually acting as a soldier, you'll be executed. You're fighting outside the uniform, you're outside the Geneva Convention. And so he was imprisoned in a school building, obviously wasn't in use for scholastic purposes at the time, and he records how he managed to escape from there. It was just after Black Week, where the British suffered 3 defeats in the space of a week. So finally, there's a little bit of good news. He managed to escape, walking at night, following railway lines. He approached a house, happened to be, the white man living there happened to be British, not an Afrikaner, as in of Dutch descent, who took him in, who hid him down a mine for a while. Finally, he got on a train, and the train took him to Lourenço Marques. That's now Maputo, Mozambique, then a Portuguese colony, neutral territory. So he was free. You should see this film about it entitled Young Winston. Came out in the early 70s, starring Anthony Andros in the title role. It was about the right age when it came out. He's roughly the same age that Churchill was at the time of the incident. So he got back to the United Kingdom, and he stood for election as a Conservative in Oldham, near Manchester. So he was elected, that was that. So he was one of the best known young MPs. And after his father died, his mother married a woman married a man only slightly older than Winston Churchill, which she found quite embarrassing. After some years, she got divorced, and then she married a man who was actually younger than Winston Churchill, which he hated. The other thing is, the family tried to keep it a closely guarded secret that his father had died of syphilis, and his father towards the end had been shambling, bumbling, losing his eyesight, increasingly irascible. And one time when Churchill was being irksome, as he often was at a dinner party, someone said to him, "Winston, what did your father die of?" The other thing is, Churchill, his surname was actually Spencer Churchill, double-barreled surname, as in Princess Diana, her maiden name was Spencer, was distantly related to him. But at Harrow, the boys had to process in alphabetical order, and he decided that Spencer Churchill put him too far down the school roll. So he wanted to be higher at the alphabet, we'll drop the Spencer. there was an American novelist called Winston Churchill around the same time. So Winston Churchill, the British one, often went by Winston S. Churchill to distinguish him from the American novelist who was his namesake. And to begin with, the American author was far better known than the British politician. So he's Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. All right. So then in 1904, he dramatically crossed the floor. He ratted, as he said. He was later to re-rat, as he also said. He left the Conservatives and joined the Liberals. And of course, people said he was a Judas, but there's also the sense that he was a rat off a sinking ship. He knew the Liberals were going to win the next election. The war in South Africa had dragged on. It had exposed the level of poverty in society. 1/3 of volunteers had been turned down for being physically unfit, just malnourished, having rickets and various childhood diseases. So the Liberals had better ideas. And the Conservatives were talking about tariff reform, bringing in import taxes, and they said this would make it for expensive food. So the Liberals, they were in government from December 1905. They called an election. January 1906, they were returned with a thumping majority. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman was Prime Minister. He lost no time in appointing Churchill to the cabinet, and he'd only been an MP for a few years. So he was an MP for Manchester North West back then, if memory doesn't play me false. So Churchill, he served in various cabinet positions. He got on well with Lloyd George, and of course, a few years earlier, he would have spat blood at the name of Lloyd George because Lloyd George was regarded as being pro-Boer, saying that locking up Boer civilians in South Africa was uncivilized, and the United Kingdom was unrighteous in fighting in this cause, and so forth. But the two got on famously, and Churchill, he was a bit of a cynic, a time server, an opportunist. The man had his flaws, but to believe that really political parties were simply vehicles for great personalities. So a bit like Boris Johnson would view it. So he's a showboater and he's a showman. Anyway, so he was Home Secretary briefly during the Sydney Street siege at the East End of London. Various Lithuanian anarchist revolutionaries were cornered. There was a shootout. The Scots Guards were called. Churchill was there because Home Secretary was in charge of policing, with a top hat, and a fire broke out, and he ordered the fire brigade not to put it out anyway. They were killed in the fire, the anarchists, but one of them wasn't accounted for. Did he escape? Was his body just charred beyond recognition? That's that. He was also Chancellor of the Exchequer, and this is the time of the Anglo-German naval race, really building up the Royal Navy, as well as trying to lay the foundations of a welfare state, old age pensions. And Churchill brought in a lot of legislation which we'd be grateful for today about tea breaks and things like that. Job centres, as we now call them, because previously, if you were jobless, you had to walk from place to place asking for work. Things like that. Free medical inspections for children, free milk for children in school because they couldn't all afford it at home. Got rid of by Thatcher in the early 70s. Maggie Thatcher, milk snatcher. When she was Education Secretary, she said we no longer needed it. Milk monitors used to see that you got your daily moo juice back then. Anyway, so the First World War broke out, and Churchill, he'd been on good terms with the Germans, and again, because he had friends in high places, he'd been allowed to attend German military manoeuvres only 2 years earlier, and he had a certain admiration for the Teuton. So when there was that assassination in Sarajevo, the cabinet reflected, saying, well, if there is to be a conflict, happily we'll be no more than spectators. And then there was this German invasion of Belgium, and a cabinet meeting started. At the outset of the meeting, it appeared that the United Kingdom was going to stay neutral. By the end, Churchill and a couple of others had talked the other 20 Liberal ministers saying, no, we must issue an ultimatum and declare war if Germany doesn't withdraw immediately. So that was that. The First World War was on. He was the first Lord of the Admiralty, as in the politician in charge of the Royal Navy. Took it very seriously. So he was always a man of imagination, and there was all this slogging match on the Western Front, and he said it was like fighting machine guns with the breasts of brave men. That, going over the top was not going to make much progress. Even if you did gain some territory, you gained these yards at just an unbearable price in the number of men killed. At that rate, by the time the British Army got to Berlin, the United Kingdom's population would have been extinct. So he said, so you either win by slaughter or by manoeuvre, so let's have more manoeuvre so we can have less slaughter. Can we surround the Central Powers on a Europe-wide scale? So knock away the props, and David Lloyd George, Chancellor of the Exchequer, took up this idea that the Ottoman Empire was the weak link in the chain. If that could be severed, then the Ottomans would be knocked out. The Russians were really under pressure, and so then supplies could be shipped to them, possibly reinforcements, all the rest of it through the Bosphorus. So sail through the Dardanelles onto the Bosphorus and bombard Istanbul. We then called it Constantinople until such time as Johnny Turk threw in the towel. Well, anyway, it didn't work. There'd been 3 feasibility studies into it, and twice it had been concluded it was impossible. On the 18th of March 1915, there was a big bombardment of around the Dardanelles, and the Ottomans, they saw off the Royal Navy. First of all, it was supposed to be only a naval expedition, but the admiral in charge, he lost 5 battleships in one day. He blanched at that and he turned around. Should he have pressed on? But then that might have been the sunk cost fallacy. You can see why he was shocked, because these battleships had over 1,000 sailors. I'm not saying that all 1,000 that were killed, many of them were rescued, but still these ships were obviously, they cost a bomb. So that was that. All right, has to be a land operation. So the Anzacs have been formed at Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. They've been massed at Cyprus and in Malta and in Egypt. But anyway, they landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and the French and the Indians landed as well. Partly on the mainland of Turkey, but anyway, it didn't work. So that's Anzac Day, the day of the landings in April 1915, and the battle went on till December. Well, really January 1916, they completed the pullout. Ian Hamilton was Churchill's chum, who was in charge of the operation, who was killed quite early in the battle. Not Ian Hamilton, the Dunblane guy. Anyway, so it all went very badly, and then Churchill had to take the rap, say what a fool, it was a disaster. It wasn't as cataclysmic as people make out. More Ottomans were killed than Allied soldiers in that battle, and obviously the Allies outnumbered the Ottomans, so the Ottomans could ill afford these losses. As you can imagine, the Ottomans saw themselves as defending their capital because it wasn't very far away from Istanbul, so then was absolutely top priority. They rushed troops there from all quarters of the empire, thereby more or less denuding themselves elsewhere, allowing the Arab revolt to get going. It took the pressures off the Russians and so on, because the Royal Navy was there bombarding the Ottomans, and the Ottomans didn't have very much artillery. So that was that. It was an Allied defeat because their objective was to seize the Dardanelles, and they failed. But in terms of casualties, they succeeded, I suppose. So that was that. And people say, oh, the Anzacs suffered terribly, and a lot of them were killed. Although more Frenchmen were killed than Anzacs, but you never hear about that one. I suppose because compared to the Western Front, the casualty figures were not that high. Anyway. And there are all these myths saying, oh, the British are on the beach drinking tea when we're fighting here. I really don't think that anyone think that was a good time for a cuppa when you want to storm ashore. So I think we should obviously stop with the national chauvinism and trying to insult and belittle different nationalities. Everybody did their bit, but obviously for the Allies, it was not a victory. So he thought he should take the rap from that, and he volunteered for the Royal Scots, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army. He went to the Western Front and he fought there. So he was very fond of millinery, and wearing that particular hat seemed to thrill him. He was very generous with his cigars, and often giving out cigars to those who smoked. But he only spent a few months at the front, and eventually he was back to the cabinet. So many serving members of Parliament also served as officers in the army at the time. Anyway, so the war finally came to an end, and his strategy was not to negotiate, as in not to have a draw, but to fight to the finish and then have a generous peace. He thought the same thing was right over South Africa. So that was that. He got on very well with Jan Christian Smuts, who was Prime Minister of South Africa at that time, and indeed again later. So then a conflict broke out in Ireland with the IRA starting to kill members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, and Churchill was all for, well, let's be firm and let's give the IRA what for. So forming the RIC Special Reserve, getting former servicemen to join, because the RIC was very depleted in numbers, get Englishmen, Welshmen, Scotsmen to join, fill in the gaps. And obviously they had a counter-insurgent role, so they were largely a gendarmerie rather than an ordinary police force. But there were breaches of discipline, and they sometimes wronged the civilian population. So Churchill sometimes carries the can for that one too. But when it came to negotiation, he met Michael Collins from July 1921 on, and got on very well with him, and even put his arm around him, showed him a map of the British Empire, saying, why don't you come in, run this with us? And that had a deep effect on Collins, probably helped him sign the treaty in the end. And he'd been dead against the IRA, Churchill. We could definitely see issues from the other angle, and eventually said that when Collins was killed on the 22nd of August 1922, Collins still said that he was a valiant leader of a gallant race. So Churchill's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had been well known for his opposition to Irish Home Rule, and was very cynical about it. It was certainly a matter of being politique, saying, you know, the orange card will be the one to play if the grand old man goes for Home Rule. That's Gladstone, and if he does, please God, the orange card will be the ace and not the 2. And they've gone to Belfast and saying, if it comes to Home Rule and they try and impose it on Ulster, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right. Now, Churchill had completely the opposite view. When Home Rule had come up shortly before the First World War, he'd gone to Belfast with his wife, Clementine Hosier. Incidentally, he got married in 1909. That's when they moved in there. And he'd addressed a Home Rule rally. I think I'm right in saying it's at Casement Park, as in the GAA ground. And he'd said, no, Home Rule is the right thing. And so some loyalists were incensed by this. They thought it was betraying his father's memory and wanted to tip his car into the Lagan, drown him. If it wasn't for the presence of his wife, some said they may have done so. But now, Churchill's not legally or morally bound to agree with his father. He's allowed to change his mind. Randolph Churchill might have changed his mind at some point if he'd lived longer. There we are. But obviously what the IRA wanted was not Home Rule, was a republic. Well, they didn't get it. Anyway, so what's the next thing? So he'd served in various offices in the 1920s, and one of the big issues was the gold standard. The United Kingdom had gone off the gold standard in the First World War. So you could go, when there's a gold standard, you can go into a bank and exchange cash for gold or gold for cash. And it was against his better judgment that he went along with it, but the expert opinion was it was the right thing to do. And so I said the value of sterling was then too high. That made unemployment was too high. There was the slump. There was this long-term unemployment in the 1920s that just wouldn't go down. What were they to do about it? And the Labour Party became the major party. The Liberals been pushed back. Churchill, I should say that he left the Liberals after the First World War. He stood as a constitutionalist and lost. Later he was elected for Dundee. And the Scottish National Party was a lunatic fringe group back then. The SNP candidate against him had served under him in the Royal Scots in France. Anyhow, so he's represented several different constituencies. Later on, he represented Wanstead and Woodford in northeast London. And some communists were standing against him as well. So he rejoined the Conservative Party. So he described himself as an anti-socialist free trader. So some conservatives were distinctly cool on him. They thought he was a glory boy. They didn't like this prima donna. He'd made many mistakes. His mother, incidentally, about this time in the early 20s, she fell down the stairs and died. That was the end of her. So his brother Jack got married. He had a daughter called Clarissa, the one who was Sir Anthony Eden's second wife. So Churchill, he had 4 daughters and 1 son. One of his daughters died in infancy. The others all lived. One of them became a minor, Sarah Churchill, a minor Hollywood actress right after the Second World War. There was Mary Churchill, I don't recall the other one. She's the mother of Nicholas Soames, who's one of the most senior Conservative MPs to this day. Churchill's son Randolph was only briefly in Parliament, despite his father campaigning for him, and the surname Churchill was about the biggest advantage you could possibly have in the 1940s. He was defeated in Plymouth by Michael Foot, that standard bearer of the far left. Randolph Churchill, as in son of the famous Winston, his own son was also called Winston Churchill. And so for some generations it's gone Randolph Winston. They've alternated the names through the generations. So Churchill so loathed Harrow that he sent his son to Eton. Because Winston Churchill's own father, Lord Randolph, had gone to Eton and detested it, which is why Winston Churchill had gone to Harrow. But they've been to Eton ever since. Anyway, so the thing is, Randolph Churchill, the son of the Prime Minister, he was a very volatile character, someone who would always cause trouble. I can't remember who said the most scary words apart from war has been declared is Randolph just arrived at the party, who would have these temper tantrums, start shrieking at people, just behaving like a complete dildo. And people said, why are you so horrifically rude to waiters? He said, well, I'm just as rude to dukes. So sometimes he just really had no manners. So he was at Eton and was also getting caned for being uppity. And then there was a place at Christ Church, Oxford, the grandest college in Oxford University. It came up early. I think some guy had suddenly been killed in an accident. So went up there and then he dropped out of Oxford. But that wasn't that unusual in those days, wasn't considered a disgrace, because of course the Churchill family had so much money that Randolph, he didn't need a degree. There were loads of jobs he had that he could get through contacts. And he came back famously to that whole king and country debate. So Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933. And the Oxford Union debated the motion, this House would under no circumstances fight for king and country. There was a lot of pacifism. A lot of people reacted to the horror of the Great War and were determined never to fight. There'd been a peace ballot by the League of Nations Union, in which the League of Nations Union sent out millions of ballot papers to people saying, would you vote to never ever fight again? A majority of people said they would never fight no matter what. And so the Oxford Union passed this by quite a big majority. And Randolph Churchill, he came back the next week. He'd gone down, saying, to a special motion to direct the secretary of the Oxford Union, that's the Debating Society of Oxford University, to strike that from the record of the society because they thought it was such a disgraceful avowal, this pacifist motion. But he didn't succeed, and it garnered a lot of column inches in the press. There was somebody who wrote into some newspaper decades later, a German chap, said this had a profound effect on Adolf Hitler, who read these stories in the German newspapers with great interest and said that the British ruling class have really lost their courage and they'll never fight us, with obviously disastrous consequences, him drawing the wrong conclusion there. Anyway, Churchill, he'd finally proposed to Clementine Hozier shortly before the First World War at Blenheim Palace. He dropped all sorts of hints in letters to her. He took her for a walk to this sort of faux Grecian temple, this folly at the grounds of Blenheim Palace, and looking at some beetle climbing up the wall. If the beetle gets this level on the wall, will I to propose or not? But finally he did, and that was that. Had quite a happy marriage. Now, I think it was Henry Kissinger who said power is an aphrodisiac, but Churchill was always faithful to his wife. He'd even been accused of being a homosexual before the First World War, and he's successfully sued for libel on that one. I say accused because, of course, in those days it was a crime, and even if you weren't convicted, if that was believed about you, your political career was over. Even in the 1980s, it was highly controversial to be gay, but he wasn't anti-gay himself. He had some gay friends, although he didn't actually advocate legalizing it. He was not somebody who banged on about the issue that they should be prosecuted. He was out of the cabinet later on. Obviously, the Labour government came in 1929. There have been moves towards reform in the colonies, and in the early 20s he'd agreed to some of this for East Africa, although he disliked the way that Indians were getting the vote in Kenya. So he revealed himself to have some shocking racist bigotry, saying that they are drawn from mostly from the very lowest class of coolies. They cannot be put on equal footing with whites and things like that. Or saying that Hindus, their Jew is doom and things like that. How they pullulate alarmingly. He thought that Islam was bad news and blah blah blah. So some of his views would be regarded as shocking today. So he certainly wasn't anti-Semitic. Had Jewish friends. Lord Rothschild, that pillar of Anglo Jewry, had been a close friend and political ally of his father. So he was quite attracted to Zionism from an early stage. What else? And then there was a lot of agitation in India by the Congress Party. Churchill thought that Nehru, Gandhi, and their co-agitators ought to be locked up, and there should be no concessions. Some people say, oh well, he's just being a curmudgeon. He's rather enjoying being a grumpy old man, and it's hypocritical of him because when he was in cabinet, he had agreed to some minor reforms. He denounced the Jallianwala Bagh massacre as monstrous, saying it stands in isolation. Well, it does, but I suppose he wasn't firm enough about that one, denouncing it as evil, as murder, as he should have done. Anyway, so then he started thundering like an Old Testament prophet against Adolf Hitler, and by the early 1930s, people had heard of Hitler, and Churchill was in Germany one time researching a biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. And he happened to be not very far away from Hitler, and they arranged to have lunch together. Now, Churchill was woeful at languages. As Anthony Eden said, I had to translate Churchill's French into French. Someone once went into a room and said, does anybody here speak French? And Winston Churchill put his hand up and said, je, for instance. But anyway, he would have had to have an interpreter to speak to Hitler. But the last minute, Hitler cancelled the lunch, so they never met. Anyway, so Churchill, he had said things about, Mussolini, the Prime Minister of Italy, saying he was a great Roman lawgiver and things like that, even gone there and addressed a fascist rally. Now, the word fascist was nothing like as toxic back then than it is now. The people thought that communism was a greater danger. Bolshevism, Churchill said it was animalism, ought to be strangled in its cradle, had been an outspoken advocate of strong military intervention in the Russian Civil War on the white side against the Reds. And of course, the communists had killed just so many people in the very early days. And you know, so many people joined fascism to stop communism, and I know vice versa. But since communism came first, such an argument is more exculpatory of fascism than the other way around. And the thing is, there was a dictatorship in Italy, but that was established only gradually. So this is how Mussolini was so cunning. He dismantled democracy piecemeal. It wasn't a one fell swoop. And you know, his accession to power was greeted with widespread relief by all sorts of people in Italy and abroad. And we knew just how bad it was to become later. Anyway, so there was an article that Churchill wrote in the 1930s in which he even praised Hitler. But he said they shouldn't be allowed to rearm, we must uphold the Treaty of Versailles. Other people say, well, actually, that treaty was conceived in ire, and we were too wrathful, we're too vengeful. We must be Ruth now and let them out of it. It's unreasonable, and treat them decently, and they'll behave decently. Well, Churchill said appeasement, that's like feeding the crocodile in the hope that it will eat you last. So he said, no, we must stand firm, and we must rigidly enforce it. And people said, oh, you know, just shut up, you're a warmonger. He even posed with a Tommy gun one time, and that's why the Germans put about a poster of him saying Churchill wanted for incitement to murder, that he was a warmonger. And he was fascinated by military affairs, by foreign affairs, not so much economics or social reform. It was as an affectation, pretending to care for the needy. He'd walked around some of the economically deprived areas of Manchester before the First World War and saying, my goodness, imagine living here and never seeing beautiful things, or living in such privation. Doesn't something need to be done to address the hardships that these people face on a daily basis? And he'd also introduced things like fines and probation to keep the prison population down. But he was a staunch believer in the efficacy of the death penalty. But that was an uncontroversial position back in those days. So yeah, he was out of the cabinet in the 1930s, and for the Round Table Conference in 1931, when Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was invited here, Churchill said that this was unacceptable, saying he's a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, and we see him striding half naked up the steps of the palace to parley with the King Emperor on an equal basis. It's nauseating. Although he was actually speaking about Gandhi going to the Viceroy's palace in Delhi, but then Gandhi was invited here to London, was lionized here also by Lancashire mill workers, despite the fact his protests had put some of them out of work. So he was one of Churchill's disputants whom Churchill disliked the most. I don't think it was racist at all. They were saying he's like a fakir of the type well known in the East. Nothing about he dislikes him for being Indian. There were some very distasteful things Churchill said about Indians elsewhere, but not in that particular quotation. Anyway, so he said that there'll be Brahmin rule. If India went independent, it would be cataclysmic. Or as Churchill said, the loss of India would be fatal to us. It could not fail to reduce us to the scale of a second-rank power. Well, on that, he was on the money. You might think it's a good thing, but there's no doubt that Indian independence certainly diminished the United Kingdom's might. And obviously, it just couldn't compete. It was not on the scale of the Soviet Union or the United States, and can never, ever be a hyperpower again. So Churchill wasn't taken seriously on appeasement because he was so immoderate on India and some other issues. Anyway, but the Great Depression was going on, and people were really concerned about this sort of bread and butter issue. There have been severe cutbacks, and of course when he'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer, he'd been part of this 10-year rule will have military spending plans on the basis that there will be no major war for 10 years. So such parsimony starved the armed forces of the necessary cash they needed to upgrade to the latest military technology. And he was absolutely fascinated with aviation. And he flew planes in the First World War and afterwards, and it was an extraordinarily perilous undertaking in those days because obviously powered flight was in its infancy. The Wright brothers had only first flown in North Carolina in, when was it, 1903. So many pilots crashed and died, and some of his friends did. But anyway, that didn't stop him. He was almost suicidally brave, maybe because he suffered from the black dog, as he said, depression. Well, seemed to be a bit bipolar. Sometimes down in the dump and just so incredibly gloomy. He was in these tenebrous moods for days, wouldn't get out of bed. But other times he tended to be hypomanic. He was simply bursting with energy and inspiring everyone else with optimism. So that's why he was able to take up his task with buoyancy when it came to the Second World War, or as someone said, mobilize the English language and send it into battle. So he was an absolute prolix author, journalist, and so on, as well as a very bibulous, consuming so much, Dom Perignon. So his finances were not in a good state for someone who had such expensive tastes. But he said he was never so poor he couldn't afford a bottle of champagne for himself and one for a friend. So he bought Chartwell down in Kent. That was his private estate there. And there was a certain financier who had a great admiration for Churchill, gave him loads of money, and there was no need to declare your interests in those days. So that wouldn't pass muster ethically today. Anyway, he was exasperated by the antics of his son and heir, Randolph. And Randolph, when he was 19, was going around in a chauffeur-driven Bentley, going to the United States and trying to make a name for himself, was a tireless self-publicist and stood for the Empire Crusade. There was his campaign in the early 30s to try and prevent Indian steps towards self-governance. But anyway, so Churchill, he led a group of Tory diehards in opposition to the India Act of 1935. Well, he failed. Anyway, so in the late 30s, people began to think that he was right about Hitler, that the Third Reich kept breaking its promises and taking more territory and rearming even more than it said it was going to do. So Stanley Baldwin, he recognized that Churchill was actuated by the noblest of motives. He didn't impugn his honor or try to ascribe any unworthy motive to him, thinking he was actuated solely by a patriotic desire to promote national security and to defend freedom. Anyway, so then 1938, obviously there's a change of policy under Neville Chamberlain, huge rearmament ordered after Munich. Nancy Astor, she always loathed Churchill. Nancy Astor, the first woman to take a seat in the House of Commons. Of course, Countess Markievicz, the Sinn Féiner, had been the first woman elected, but hadn't taken a seat because she wasn't going to take an oath to the British monarch. So Nancy Astor, or Langhorne as she's born, this woman from Virginia, married into the Astor family, a British-American family, prominent in the conservative circles. Her husband was ennobled, so he couldn't be in the House of Commons any longer. So Nancy Astor was elected for his seat. I think it was a Plymouth one, Plymouth Devonport. And there was this famous encounter between them where she said, Churchill, if I was married to you, I'd put poison in your coffee. And he said, Nancy, if I was married to you, I'd drink it. But anyway, she was a passionate believer in appeasement, that they must avoid war. Churchill, he'd also got on very well with Edward VIII. Of course, until 1936, Edward VIII was the Prince of Wales. And indeed, Winston Churchill was the only Prime Minister who was addressed by his Christian name by Edward VIII. All the others he referred to as Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, Mr. Baldwin, or whoever it was. And when it came to the abdication crisis, Churchill was the only politician I know of who said that King Edward VIII ought to be allowed to marry Mrs. Simpson and have her as his queen, not just a morganatic marriage. But anyway, it wasn't to be. And we all know on the 10th of December 1936 that Edward VIII abdicated. The other ironic thing about that is, of course, Churchill and Edward VIII had diametrically opposed views on the German issue. Edward VIII being deeply sympathetic to Germany and thinking that appeasement was absolutely the right policy and that the United Kingdom should do nothing to stop German expansionism. You could say it's a bit hypocritical complaining about them taking over territory. It's not as though the United Kingdom has never taken an inch of land itself. And people suspect that Edward VIII was passing secrets to the Abwehr, or Joachim Ribbentrop, who was the German ambassador to the court of St. James at that time. And there were even these scurrilous rumours that Ribbentrop was sharing the affections of Mrs. Simpson. Anyway, so that was that. But 1939, people are starting to take him seriously again. And then he was always slagging off Chamberlain, saying that you're like being resolute for irresolution, or you're solid as air, or things like that. It's ridiculous, this limp-wristed, feeble policy on appeasement and giving in over the Sudetenland. Anyway, so 1st of September 1939, we all know that the Third Reich invaded Poland, and 3rd of September 1939, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. So Churchill was immediately brought back into the cabinet as for the First Lord of the Admiralty, as in the politician in charge of the Royal Navy, and the message was sent out to all vessels of the Royal Navy saying Winston is back. Well, everybody knew who it was. So that was that, and he started broadcasting the BBC almost straight away. And he actually didn't have a wonderful radio manner, though he was a superb orator in person, and he studied the art of oratory very carefully, and his speeches were all meticulously written out and rehearsed. They weren't off the cuff. His one-liners were very much studied by him. Anyway, so then he was saying that the war was going to last at least 3 years. So he was being straight with people and saying the United States was going to come in on Britain's side. There seemed very little chance of that in those days. Reporting on the sinking of the Graf Spee, this German surface raider was named after a very distinguished German naval officer of the First World War. Anyway, there seemed to be little chance that Churchill was be Prime Minister, but Neville Chamberlain was PM, was a rather uninspiring figure. Then it came to the Norway campaign. Obviously, the Royal Navy was involved in that. Wasn't successful for the United Kingdom. April 1940, when the Third Reich invaded Norway, because Germany was dependent on iron ore from Sweden, and the Gulf of Bothnia, off the coast of Sweden, the sort of inner coast, in between Sweden and Finland, is icebound in the winter, so therefore the iron is taken out by railway to Norway and shipped through the Norwegian Sea and along to Germany. So the idea was that the Germans were going to seize this area before the French and British did so, and they were considering doing so. So they almost invaded Norway, which would have been a violation of neutrality, which of course was to be the height of hypocrisy, breaching the very principle for which the whole war is supposedly fought. That's the premise. We shan't accept this aggression. It's completely unwarranted. And then, of course, it would be nauseating if the French and British were to do just that, which, of course, they did in relation to Iran and Iceland not long afterwards. Anyway, so the Germans landed first, and Vidkun Quisling, the leader of the Nationalsamling, or National Union, the fascist party, he announced he'd seized power, and he was someone who was really a fervent anti-communist. He didn't marry a Russian, he certainly wasn't anti-Russian, and he'd seen the unspeakable suffering that communism had visited upon the people of the Soviet Union. Millions of people starved completely avoidably. So the Germans, they cooperated with him. They later realized that he commanded little following amongst the Norwegian people, but nevertheless, he was supposedly Prime Minister. So the French and British were fighting there, some of the French Foreign Legion, some of them were Spanish refugees from the Spanish Civil War, the French Foreign Legion. But anyway, the French and British lost that, and the Royal Navy gave a decent account of itself, sunk several German capital ships, so the German surface fleet didn't present much of a threat. After that, I know there was the Bismarck, but the Bismarck was almost unique. Anyway, so there were the Norway debates in the House of Commons, and I can't remember who it was who said, for God's sake, go, to Neville Chamberlain. So then on the 10th of May, Chamberlain, he fell on his sword, he resigned as Prime Minister. Very shortly afterwards, he discovered he had terminal throat cancer, which was actually very far advanced. He died in November 1940. Had he stayed on as Prime Minister, he would have died anyway. They would have had to choose a new Prime Minister. It's a fascinating thing to contemplate. What would have happened if Chamberlain had remained as Prime Minister but died in November 1940? Would he have made peace by then? If not, who would have become Prime Minister after him? Would it have been Churchill, or would Churchill only have got it in that May 1940? So between Churchill really and the Earl of Halifax. The Earl of Halifax was a very distinguished nobleman from Yorkshire, and he had been to Eton, he'd been to Christchurch. I think he was a fellow of all souls, so really a stellar intellectual. And he'd served as Viceroy of India, 1926 to 1931. He was a very lanky figure. He and Churchill were like little and large. He was about 6'4". The Holy Fox, as the Churchill family dubbed him. He only had one hand. It says right hand, he wore a glove with a dummy hand. As much as possible, he kept his right hand behind his back. And he liked fox hunting, and he liked high Anglican worship. Hence, he was the Holy Fox, which also sounds like Halifax. But people said that he was inclined to parley with the United Kingdom. Think they should negotiate between the United Kingdom and Germany. In the end, they didn't. But later he said, well, let none of us surrender till we're on the ground belching on our own blood. But and King George VI actually sent for Churchill, partly because he would command the support of the Labour Party. Now, Churchill was a bit of a hate figure amongst the Labour Party. They remember how he sent the troops into Tony Pandy in Wales before the First World War to put down some riots, and some of the miners who were killed by him. Well, not personally by him, but some of the troops that he dispatched there. Perhaps it was an overreaction. And the Labour Party was willing to come into government. They formed a government of national unity, and so he gave lots of cabinet posts to Labour and to the Liberals, who were quite small in those days. The Simonite Liberals, I think. I'm not sure about the Samuelite ones. And that was the strength of the nation. So Churchill, he immediately addressed the nation, saying it was the evident wish and will of Parliament that such a government be formed. He received His Majesty's commission to form a new administration. So that was that. He told the people, I have nothing to offer but blood, sweat, tears and toil. So it was absolutely straight with people that this was going to be a very long and grueling ordeal, saying we've got many, many months of struggle and of suffering ahead of us. and saying that the enemy was unsurpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. So people realized just what a grave undertaking this was. And still saying the United States is going to come in. Well, fortunately, had a fairly good working relationship with Roosevelt, president at the time. Not as good as we were led to believe in the newsreels, but he had the Lend-Lease agreement. Remember, he was half American, and it managed to get some British children evacuated over to the United States. Fortunately for the UK, Roosevelt had got these derogations to the Neutrality Act saying it's important for our national security that the United Kingdom remains well armed, so we're allowed to sell weapons to them, which otherwise would have been forbidden. The United States would not have been allowed to sell weapons to a belligerent in any conflict. Had things been different, had there been a different president of the United States, then the whole result of the war might have been different. Remember, the America First Committee was very strong and active, very popular back then. A committee saying the United States ought to stand aloof from any foreign wars lest they be dragged in. I think it was John Adams said America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Or Washington had exhorted his people to avoid entangling alliances, and here Roosevelt was breaching that doctrine. Anyway, so there was fighting on the high seas. There was the Battle of Britain, of course, and Churchill's the one who dubbed it the Battle of Britain, and we all know that the Royal Air Force prevailed in that one. He said the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Anyway, so he said that if the British Empire should last for 1,000 years, men would say this was their finest hour. Or he obviously he acclaimed the RAF for achieving this vital victory, saying, "Never in the field of human conflict have so many owed so much to so few," because a relatively small number of RAF combat pilots had prevailed over the Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, and the RAF could just produce more planes than Germany could. So Germany wasn't totally committed to the war in terms of the economy, still wanted guns and butter, still wanted consumer goods. It was only too late. They went for a total commitment to the war economy when Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, was put in charge of it. And if they'd gone right out from day one, they probably would have won. So very fortunately for the United Kingdom, they didn't. Whereas the UK, more or less from day one, said, we're going to forget about living standards. It was really all for the war. And obviously that succeeded. Really, the United Kingdom didn't win. Really, the Soviet Union didn't. It was fought with Soviet blood and American gold. And all right, the UK was fairly important, but there's this self-flattering myth that the United Kingdom won. Militarily, it didn't. I mean, the casualties is actually not that high. Not wishing to be callous, I mean, if your relative died, that's just incalculable, the loss. But 400,000 British servicemen killed, which out of a population of 50 million or so, was not that high. You look at the just enormously high death toll of the Soviet Union, of 20 million people killed quite easily, out of a population of, what was it, something like 140 million. So there's really just no comparison. Anyway, so Churchill even considered about Ireland. Would some of the ports in the south of Ireland have to be seized? Twice making public offers to Eamon de Valera, the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, now or never, a nation once again. Well, he said never, partly because he thought the Axis was going to win and better deal. Partly we're going to split the country, might even call it a civil war. There were some pro-Nazi elements in the Irish Republic. Well, we weren't a republic back then. In the south of Ireland, notably the IRA. You know, Dan Breen, an IRA man, having a Nazi flag up and a portrait of Hitler on his wall all through the war, and indeed well after the war, despite the Holocaust being well known about by that stage. So Churchill obviously was in 10 Downing Street, going to check as the country retreat and drinking a lot. The cabinet war rooms, you can see his underground bunker, and there's a special lavatory for his sole use. Actually, it was a telephone to Roosevelt, so speaking to them an awful lot. So Churchill, he was odd, dictating to secretaries in the bath, and happy to be seen by his staff in the nude, so rather eccentric. And he took the most lively interest in espionage. He was like a schoolboy, very excitable about cloak and dagger sort of stuff, wanting to intervene. But he said, we mustn't call these things Operation Bunny Hug or Ballyhoo, because it just seems so silly, and if someone's relative was killed in it, they will find it very galling to think that this had such a ridiculous name, and their relative was killed in all that. So he found it difficult to get on with Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the French Committee for National Liberation, saying, the heaviest cross I have to bear is the cross of Lorraine. Lorraine being the cross of Lorraine being the symbol of the Free French, a cross, but with a second horizontal bar. By a curious irony, of course, it's the symbol of French resistance in the 15th century fight against the English in the 100 Years' War, even though the English were the French allies by that stage. So one agonizing decision Churchill had to take, he said that the most difficult in the entire war was about Merzel-Kabir. After the surrender of France on the 22nd of June 1940, French Navy was stationed there at Mers el Kabir on the coast of Algeria, and it included many formidable warships. So people were very worried they might fall into German hands. The Vichy Vist, as in obeying Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, might do as the Germans say. The Germans might say, hand us over the ships, or indeed we want the ships and the crew. Even induced the French to declare war on the British. There were enough Anglophobes there, and they felt that the British had left them in the lurch and fled at Dunkirk. Although having said that, actually, about 20% of those evacuated at Dunkirk were French. And once France surrendered, some of these Frenchmen said, okay, we're going back. And they were allowed to go back. I mean, all right, they were being good soldiers. They were ordered to surrender, so they did. So they went back because France was at peace. France was a neutral country after 1940, but it could easily become Germany's co-belligerent. Anyway, Admiral Darlin at Algeria, who's offered a number of options by the British. You can sail with us, join us, and carry on to fight for the freedom of France, be free French, not Vichy French, or sail to the United States and be interned by them, it's a neutral country, or scuttle your ships. And if we don't hear from you within an hour, we're opening fire, and there's no reply within an hour. So they didn't ask them twice, and on the Churchill's order, they opened fire. So anyway, over 1,000 French soldiers were killed. Some of them fell into the sea where there was burning oil, and it was like ship fat being fried alive. So it was a really horrific episode. Anyway, as you can imagine, the French were absolutely irate. They thought this was the most dastardly attack on a neutral country, and only perfidious Albion would do something so utterly despicable and dishonourable. But so Churchill then went into the House of Commons, and he didn't know what reception to expect, but he found himself cheered to the echo, especially by Labour MPs, because he'd showed bottle. He was going to do it, no matter what it took. He would be ruthless, and that was that. And had he not done that, it could have been game over for the United Kingdom, because the Royal Navy was bigger than the German Navy, but not that much bigger. Remember, Germany had no capital ships till 1935, when their Anglo-German naval pact said, all right, Germany has allowed ships to have 35% of the displacement of the Royal Navy. But the German ships were all modern. Some of the Royal Navy ships were over 30 years old. And the Royal Navy was actually spread across the world because there were colonies in the Far East, for instance. The Germans were almost all in the North Sea. So the Royal Navy's advantage would not have been great. And as Churchill had said even before the First World War, that the German Navy is a necessity and the Royal Navy is a luxury. You know, I think it was Admiral Jellicoe, Churchill said, he's the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. Not questioning the Admiral's competence, but if he gets it wrong, then it's curtains for the United Kingdom. Anyway, because so much of the trade was seaborne. Obviously, rationing had to be brought in because the UK imported about 2/3 of its own food prior to the war, so really every inch of land had to be turned to agriculture if it was possible, like even planting vegetables in Hyde Park and things like that. So Churchill, he still managed to get plenty of alcohol and his big cigar, and the German propaganda broadcast was saying, who was the man with the big cigar, who's that big fat friend of the Jew, thinking there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the UK. There was some, but people like Lord Haw, William Joyce, I blush to mention, an Irishman, they really overestimated the degree of anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom. It didn't go down that well. Anyway, so I'm trying to think where I've got to. So late 1940, Battle of Britain has begun, and then not bombing Germany very much, just building up arms. Well, the phony war was definitely over. The Italians had declared war, so attacking Abyssinia, that was Italian ruled at the time. We now call it Ethiopia. Haile Selassie, the emperor of Abyssinia, was here, living in the United Kingdom. He came back. British troops, as in also Somali troops, Kenyans, Sudanese, defeated the Italians, and that was that. Finally an advance for the Allies, but really about the most militarily insignificant place they could have conquered. They might have just been able to cut the Italians off from ammunition, say, you want to surrender? And that was that. So largely fought at sea, the battle at the Atlantic. But fortunately, technology moved on, and the UK wasn't losing so many ships this time. They'd had the convoy system, which had finally worked in the First World War, getting sonar, and very early in the war, sharing radar with the United States. As Churchill said, it was the most valuable cargo ever sent from the British Isles to America, because of course it was top secret, really new technology, and obviously the United States was delighted to receive it. And that's why the Germans couldn't understand it. They overestimated the RAF's numbers by a factor of 3, that every time they sent over a squadron, the RAF was there to give them a very warm welcome. How did they see the people coming? There was a Royal Observation Corps on the coast with their binoculars, with their radios, with their telephones, saying that we see, 7 Messerschmitts coming in at this angle, at this altitude, and calling it into RAF headquarters to scramble people. There's also the radar, which was top secret, even though the RAF had no idea about it. So they put it about. It was all to do with eating carrots. The carrots are good for your eyesight, because they had to explain how they could see the German planes even at night. Radar. But yes, carrots are good for your eyesight, but only a tiny bit. If you eat loads of carrots a day, it'll improve your eyesight a little bit. There we are. So, oh goodness, I can't quite take this now. So, where were we? I'll have to finish it up, wrap it up, because we're coming to an hour and I can't tell you everything about Churchill all day because my face is beginning to hurt from speaking non-stop. So that was the end of 1940 and on into 1941. Then the UK taken over Iceland just in case the Germans seized it as a naval base. They ceded it to the Americans. The United States was still neutral. They declared a neutrality zone into the Atlantic, a neutrality zone all the way to Iceland, which is very helpful for the British. So the UK simply took over Iceland, which had no army. Now the Icelanders protested, but they didn't actually resist. And remember, it was nominally part of Denmark, so I suppose the Danish monarch gave permission. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, that beloved sovereign, was driven into exile. As Churchill said, was the Germans leave behind them these bludgeoned states and shattered races. King Haakon the 7th of Norway was here. The Dutch royal family had gone on to Canada. The Belgians, well, they'd surrendered. King Albert III, on his personal initiative, surrendered, even though it's supposed to be a constitutional monarchy. He and his family were held there, well, later moved to Germany. Well, I shan't go on all day. I've been up to 1941. On another occasion, I could tell you the rest of Winston Churchill's life, but that's enough for the moment.